Y'all hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I need to stay. It's kind of neat. I hadn't heard glory to his name in a long, long time. It just doesn't sound right with an old broken down upright piano that's out. Unless it's been sung to an old broken down upright piano that's out of tune with 100-year-old benches and a potbelly stove sitting about right there. That's just the way it should be when you sing something like that. At least that's what it takes me back to 400 miles in a number of years. So today I want to talk to us about leadership. And leadership's not one of my specialties, but I'm going to give it a shot. If you have a Bible, flip to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're going to go all over the place, but that's where we're going to jump from. I think Paul gives, in the opening verse of 1 Corinthians 11, the clearest expression of what Christian leadership is all about. He says, and I'm reading from my 1611 King James, "Be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." And I want us to look at Christian leadership today, jumping from that standpoint. Be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. I did some digging in the New Testament concerning words that concern following and leading. And it's amazing what I found out with a blue letter Bible in about 10 minutes. I found that for the words in Greek, follow and follower, they're used 98 times in the New Testament. That would be Dr. Paulson, mimetes, and akolutheo. 98 times. When I searched in the King James, because I always start there, all of you who use these modern translations, I'll forgive you this time. The word leader only showed up once in the New Testament. And it was in the context of the blind leading the blind. So I dug a little deeper and I looked for other synonyms like master or ruler or such. But I only found 11 instances of the word leader, where I found 98 of follow or follower. And just by simple word count, it struck me that the Bible seems to talk, or at least the New Testament, seems to talk a lot more about following than leading. Just in terms of numbers. Yet when we speak of Christians and when we speak of preparing Christians in Bible college or seminary, we tend to speak more about future leaders rather than future followers. Wow. And I'm just wondering if we don't have things a bit backwards. Because 98 to 11 isn't close. And that's why I wanted to jump off with Paul when he says, "Be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Because I have an idea, and I think I'm right about this. But in order to be a good leader, we must first be a good follower. Amen. And until we've learned how to follow, we can never learn how to lead. And not only that, in terms of what I do and what all of you either do or are studying to do, in a ministry setting, a good teacher is first a good student. And one cannot learn how to teach, that is lead, unless one has first learned how to be a good student, that is a follower. And so there is a link here that I don't think that we should miss. That in order to be a leader, one must first be a follower. And it's only by following well do we ever gain the capacity to lead well.
Yes.
And I want you to notice that this is just 180 degrees different from what is expected of us in the world. The world wants leaders. It's not particularly interesting to be a follower, but boy, it sure is fun to be the leader. And in the world, worldly leaders want to lead without following. Worldly leaders want to speak without learning.
Yeah.
And worldly leaders want the spotlight and all that comes with it, rather than the bottom of the bucket that could come with following. And I'm going to repeat this question 4 more times after I say it the first time here. What kind of leader will you be? Because I want you to take this to heart, those of you who aspire to lead. What kind of leader will you be? Will you first be a follower and then only lead reluctantly? Or will you race to the head of the line without learning how to follow and fail miserably as a leader? I want us to look at Luke chapter 22. We're going to change gears from Paul and wind back to Jesus. In Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 24. Now let me set up the context of this passage. It's in the middle of the Last Supper. Jesus has just done all of his take and eat, this is my bread, this is my body, take and drink, this is my blood. Just got finished with all of that. And in verse 24 it says, and there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest, them being the disciples. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. But you shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is chief as he that serves. For which is greater, he that sitteth, I'm trying to spit out my King James. For which is greater, he that sits at the dinner, or he that serves? Is it not he that sits at the dinner? But I am among you as he that serves. You are they which have continued with me in my temptations. So here is Jesus, the greatest of all, the very Son of the very Father, who has come to his disciples as a servant. Christian leadership is paradoxical. It is backwards from what we think it ought to be. For the King of glory has come as a servant. And he came to be a servant and to give his life for those who should have been serving him. You see how backwards that is from the way we think the story should be written? But it's completely backwards. The New Testament in Jesus' words says this 5 times, or a variation of it. Whoever saves his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life shall find it. That's 5 times throughout the New Testament. Almost as many times as the New Testament mentions leadership. Again, the leader is the follower. And it's paradoxical. If you want to lead, follow. But if you want to relegate yourself to being a bad follower, lead. You see, in our world, we lead by following. And it's only because we do follow that we can be a worthy and acceptable leader. The worldly leader wants to be on stage. He wants to be front and center and have people look at him and say, wow, what a great job you're doing. The worldly leader craves the recognition that comes with the position. And the worldly leader loves to be the center of attention. But Jesus has already let it be known. Let it not be so among you. let it not be with you that way, that he who would lead must first follow. You're familiar with Jesus' arrest. He looked just like everybody else to the point that Judas had to kiss him so that they would recognize him. His clothes didn't say anything different. He didn't have leader tattooed across his garments. He didn't wear purple or something that would make him stand out. He was one of them, and yet the very Lord of glory. So I want to ask you a second time, if we are training you to lead, what kind of leader will you be? I want to flip over now to the Gospel of John in chapter 13. If you know your New Testament, you know John 13 is foot washing. And I want to take it up in verse 12. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and was set down again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me Master and Lord, and you say well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Truly, truly, or verily, verily, I say to you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither is he that sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, you are happy if you do them." Now I want to zero in on this word ought, because that is a word that we use far too lightly in the English language. The word here in Greek is a philo. And the word of philo carries with it a bondage. You are bound to do something. You're not just like, oh, I ought to go mow my yard tonight when I get home. It's not used in that. You are owed to do this. There is a bond there that makes you under penalty for not doing it. That's the import of the word. And when Jesus said, you ought to do this to one another, he means, I am binding you to do this to one another. Now, I am not a foot washer in terms of believing that is one of the things that we are commanded to do. But what I do believe that Jesus is commanding us here is to serve one another in this way. Yes. And that we are bound to serve one another in this way. He said, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also must, if I may change the word to its real import in our language, washing one another's feet. Or you must do as I have done. Now, the Christian is called to oblige himself, to do this to one another, and to put someone else above him. Because the one who is above all put himself below all to serve all. Now, that is a direct reflection of God in and of himself. That is the triune life working itself out in our space and time. Because the God who is eternally self-giving came to this earth without ever changing who he was, and was self-giving even to the point of bowing down and doing the job of the lowest servant in the household. And then when he got finished, he got up, resumed his place, and said, okay guys, you do this too. Just as I have given, now you must give. Just as I have followed, now you must follow. Follow my lead and follow me, was exactly what he meant by his words. Remember John the Baptist's words when he had finally identified Jesus to the crowds and said, follow him. And he said, now he must increase and I must decrease. Yes. This is the kind of leadership that reflects accurately the God that we serve. The other-centered, self-giving, pouring out of oneself type of leadership that is exemplified by Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not only in eternity, but in flesh and blood in Jesus of Nazareth. When he tells us to follow him, he's telling us to follow that example, do as he did, and do it forever. To be as he is in that instance. That's the kind of leadership that is required of the Christian leader. Anything less than that is, quite honestly, not Christian. Because to be Christian is to be triune. And to be triune is to be eternally self-giving and other-centered. And if we're not doing that, then we might be able to stick a Christian label on it, but it certainly is not Christian. Again, in verse 20, in that same text, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he that receives whomever I send receives me, and he that receives me receives him that sent me." See that same follow leader pattern again? Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives the Father. That same pattern is at work in terms of following and leading. Again, if we have a worldly leader, the worldly leader wants to lead without obligation, wants to lead without that bondage, and it's even a good bondage, but it's still a bondage, of being owed to give to one another. The worldly leader wants to funnel everything through himself rather than give himself away. And the worldly leader wants to excel at the expense of others rather than letting others excel at the expense of himself. And again, I ask you a third time, what kind of leader will you be? Lest we think that this was just a passing fad of Jesus, let's look at his crucifixion. Do y'all remember the 7 sayings of the cross? Oh dear. That's like trying to remember the 10 Commandments. Let's see. Oh dear. I remember them, because I got them written down. I cheat.
Okay. Thanks goodness.
At least I'm being honest about it. One time Jesus said, "I thirst." One time he said, "It is finished." Which is basically speaking. 2 more of his sayings. I'm not going to look them up because you probably already know these. 2 more of his sayings, he was speaking directly to the Father. my God, why have you forsaken me? And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Okay, that's 4 of his sayings. But now his other 3 sayings, who was he talking to? He's talking to people. When the thief who was being crucified beside him confessed in faith, Jesus turned to him and what did he say? Right. So here's Jesus, near death. And what's he doing? Ministering to the man beside him. Leading by continuing to follow the mandate of his Father. Now, what else did he say? Let me think. Help me out here. What else did he do?
John, behold your mother.
And his mother.
Wow, yeah, that is another one of them, isn't it? Shucks. Who was he talking to?
His disciple. His follower.
And his mother.
Yeah.
The woman who brought him into this earth. He loved enough in his dying breath to give his beloved disciple charge over her life for as long as she lived. Because those were his words. "Woman, behold your son." And then turning to John, "Behold your mother." In other words, you take care of her. Again, at the point of death, following and continuing to follow that which he had been brought here to do. Now, what's the one I've forgotten? Which one have I not said? How about that? The very ones who put him to death, he's saying, don't hold that against them. An earthly leader would have said, bring down fire from heaven. Get these you-know-whats because they're killing me. But he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Out of his last 7 sayings, out of the last 7 things he said before he died, 3 of them were directed outward. That shouldn't surprise you, but I bet you never thought of it like that. 3 of them were still ministering, even up to the very end, interceding on behalf of his mother, interceding on behalf of the man who made the right choice at the 11:59 hour, and then finally interceding for the whole lot of them who had no idea what they were doing. Now that's a leader, but that's a leader because he's a follower. He knows how to follow, therefore he knows how to lead. A worldly leader won't do that. A worldly leader wants to lead in safety and wants to preserve himself and his position at all costs, rather than at the moment when he is given up for dead, still leading. And a worldly leader, rather than lifting up those who need lifted up, will push them down in order to rise himself up. I asked the question for the 4th time, what kind of leader will you be? And lest you think that Jesus' leading ended on the cross, I got news for you. Jesus' last act of leadership while he was on this earth was the kind of leadership that restores and gives hope. If the leadership that is paradoxical, the leadership that will turn the tables and take the place of the lesser, and the leadership that leads until the very end is not enough, then what about the leader that restores at the end? And for that I want you to look at John chapter 21. They had just caught their great load of fish. And they had finished eating. So when they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, now, let me pause for just a minute and reset the table for you. What happened to Peter before Jesus was crucified? I'll never leave you. I'll never desert you. High and mighty, blustering. And what did Jesus turn and say to him?
For the rooster crowed 3 times.
You'll deny me 3 times.
Yes.
And the Gospels record those 3 denials. But I want you to listen right here. So when they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He says to him, feed my lambs. He says to him again the 2nd time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my sheep. He said to him the 3rd time. Now, anybody wonder why he did this 3 times? He said to him the 3rd time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Verily, verily, I say to you, when you were young, you clothed yourself and walked where you wanted to. But when you will be old, you will stretch forth your hands, and another shall dress you and carry you whither you would not go. This he spoke, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now don't miss this, because this is important. How many times did Peter deny Jesus?
3.
How many restorations did Jesus perform? 3. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? But there is something in this even more beautiful than even that. Because in the Greek language, there are multiple words for love. And sometimes they're used interchangeably. And I'm not going to try to make the theological point about depth of love. I'm only going to make a theological point about language. Because in verse 15, when Jesus asked Peter the first time, he said, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And the verb utilized in verse 15 is agapao. Peter's answer, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," was a different verb, phileo. Second time he asked, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Again, Jesus utilizes agapao. When Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you," he uses, again, phileo. Now, I'm not good enough at this to tell you that there are these rock-solid, unassailable theological conclusions over which word or which word not to use. I just want you to draw your own conclusions from what I'm about to say. The third time that Jesus asked Peter, "Peter, do you love me?" Jesus used phileo. And when Peter answered him, "Yes, Lord, you know all things, you know that I love you," he finally agreed with Jesus and used phileo. The beautiful thing about that is that the third time that Jesus asked, Jesus met Peter where Peter was. Whatever distinctions there may be between those words, I'm not prepared to say with certainty. But the one thing that I am prepared to say with certainty is that on that third asking, Jesus stepped down to Peter and met him right where he was, so that Peter's affirmation could meet Jesus' answer. And then Jesus' final words to Peter in the New Testament, "Follow me." Without being on the same page as your leader, you will never be a good follower. And unless you're a good follower, you will never be a good leader. The worldly leader wants to magnify himself and wants people to come to him. The Christian leader, as we see Jesus do with Peter, he goes to Peter. He goes and gets him where he's at, rather than demanding him to come up to him. The worldly leader wants to win at others' expense, and the Christian leader gives himself up to allow his follower to succeed. And so I'm just going to finish this up with one very simple question. What kind of leader will you be?